So it's my pleasure to introduce the panel to you. We're going to be talking about smart investments and how we can fill community needs going forward. From my perspective, when I think about riparian and communities and how we interact with it, in human evolution, humans have been reliant on riparian areas and stream courses through their whole history. Only fairly recently have we sort of moved away from that reliance and sort of been enamored with technologies and commerce and things like that that have sort of made riparian a back burner resource for us. But I think now we're seeing that it's really not a back burner resource. We really do have to pay attention to it. It really is critical to the quality of our lives and our communities. And so I think there's a growing awareness and interest and engagement in trying to figure out how we bring back all that value that we once had and that sort of the intimate relationships that allowed us to have not just sort of a practical applied relationship with streams, but an emotional and spiritual one as well. And I think part of what we heard Assemblywoman Garcia talk about is this need to have places where people can have those kinds of expansive experiences, that a concrete jungle isn't the way to really enhance our lives. So we need more in terms of nature to interact with, to have good lives to give us pleasure and engage us. So along those lines, what we're going to talk about today is how we invest in the future, what we invest in the future, and how that might satisfy community needs. So we have 4 panel members. From my right to going down the panel, this is John Carlin, who has spoke earlier. Most of you probably saw him in the earlier panel today. He's president of River Partners, which does large-scale riparian restoration using pretty much agronomic techniques, meaning tractors and irrigation systems and stuff like that. Then we have Marissa Christensen, who's the executive director of Friends of the LA River. David Bunn, who's the director of Department of Conservation here in California, and then Ellie Cohen, who's the president of Point Blue Conservation Sciences. So what we're going to do is have each of them give about a 5-minute talk, just highlighting some ideas that they think are important for us to pay attention to as we think about riparian management and investment and how the community interface works. So we'll go through and each of them will give their talk, and then we'll open it up to the panel to ask each other a few questions and get into a little bit of discussion, and then we'll open it up to the audience to participate in that discussion more. So I think Marissa was going to go first, and I'll just let them introduce themselves as they come up. Thank you. Yeah. Either way.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Marissa Christensen. Before I get started, I'd love to know, by show of hands, before the assembly member spoke today about the river, how many of you had much of an understanding or knowledge of the Los Angeles River? Great. And how many of you have been to the Los Angeles River? Okay. Good. That helps. So this will be short. My introduction will be short. So, as the assembly member said, a lot of the river is a concrete jungle. It's 51 miles long. It courses through over a dozen different jurisdictions. The water in it is owned by the city of Los Angeles. The County Flood Control District controls its banks, and of course the Army Corps of Engineers is sort of the governing authority to speak of, and they were the ones that encased it in concrete. But it is actually a historic river. It's a historic southwestern riparian river. It's why Los Angeles is where it is. And so our organization was formed 30 years ago with the mission of bringing the river back to life. And for us, that means certainly restoring the riparian habitat and restoring the ecology of the river, but it really means building connection and community around that ecology and around experiencing the river as urban wilderness. So when we talk about restoring the Los Angeles River, there's a lot of different groups at this point that are involved in what we call the river movement in LA. Some of them think that through eminent domain, we should just buy back all of the floodplain and it should be the natural river that it once was. Some of them think that we should actually build up the infrastructure a little bit more. We are probably somewhere in between that. We certainly are about concrete removal. We're certainly about establishing ecological habitat and connections, but understand that in the realities of today, in the constraints of urban development, that's going to mean something different than it was, 100 years ago. So our primacy ends up being, like the gentleman in the front row here that was in the last discussion, he mentioned the importance of education and connecting people, children and adults, to natural experiences, and that being an expansive experience that they have that then move on to become environmental stewards and advocates themselves. So that's a huge part of what we do. And the rest of what we do is really in policy advocacy. So we helped author SB 1201, which was carried by Kevin De Leon, which actually established the public's right to access the river as a natural resource, which gave way to the ability to establish those recreation zones, which is how people are kayaking on the river today. And so that's kind of how we go about our work. We sort of build the constituency that will advocate with us so that we can have real political impact in shaping a river that becomes a resource for all Angelenos. But as the Assembly member said, these are vastly diverse communities that live along the river's banks. So for us, in our work, as we strive to have real impact in the political realm, it's really important that we're not just looking at what happens in the channel. We're not just considering river restoration to be about natural habitat, but we're considering it to be about restoring and repairing the communities that live alongside of it. So the conversation with urban river restoration like Los Angeles has really shifted from a purely environmental movement to sort of an environmental justice movement. And so it's certainly rife with all sorts of challenges and many, many different voices. But I think that's what makes the river so interesting, and of course is what kind of is so helpful in having so many different voices involved in it. So I'll pass it off to my next panelists, but looking forward to your questions.
Good afternoon. First off, I gotta say I'm impressed. The last session on the last day, you guys did great. So when our organization started almost 20 years ago, we had to pick a name, and so we're trying to think about, what would be a good name for a river conservation group, and we landed on River Partners, and it wasn't because there was a couple people that started the organization. It was because you can't really restore a river if you don't have the community next to that river engaged and valuing that work. And so it's really, the name River Partners is really river community. How do you get everybody who depends and enjoys that river on board and engaged in that restoration process? And so, we do large-scale habitat restoration projects. We're farmers. We go out, we plant habitat. It seems like it's a pretty cut and dry deal, but it really provides a lot of opportunities for community engagement. And I'm just going to list a few of those to have you guys think about it and give some general ideas in terms of how we approach it. So first off, before you ever even implement the project, we try and meet with all the neighbors, ideally the person who lived on that landscape before. Just that knowledge of the land is critical, and get that input. And the communities that are near there, what has been the use? What's their relationship to that river, that piece of property? And we try and build a consensus among the NGO and conservation communities. It's pretty amazing. There's you can get a lot of different opinions on what it means to restore someplace. And cultivate partnerships with educational organizations, universities, and try and get students out there. So that all goes into the planning phase. But then the other thing that people don't think about is that these large-scale projects, if we're going to do, 100 acres or a larger project, that involves a lot of cash. There's a lot of dollars. And so when I put my business hat on, I see our job as really taking state and federal dollars and moving those dollars into typically, underserved, under-resourced communities. And since, our little NGO has gotten involved in this, we have taken about $120 million and invested it in the Central Valley. And so what does that mean? There's lots of different ways to do that. You can hire the people that do a great job. You can hire the people that you know are going to perform. Or the other option is to go out and try and build capacity in the community you're working in and use those dollars to engage the community. So a couple of examples. We need plant material. So the plants that are really easy to grow, like oaks or cottonwoods, we'll go to high schools. These are rural communities. They usually have greenhouses in their high schools that are empty because they can't figure out a way to run the greenhouse and sell something. So we would say, we will give you a contract to grow our plant material and you can have your students grow it. We might have 5 or 6 high schools in the neighborhood growing out our plant material. That's one of the deals. We'll try and rent a warehouse or space in that community. We'll try and hire people from that community. And then we also track every dollar we spend. So if it's a choice of where are we going to buy, just basic items, sure, it'd be a lot easier to work with one, distributor, but we try and patronize small local businesses in those communities. Those open up crazy relationships that have all these implications for the benefit of the project that we don't even, we have no idea that are even out there when we start. We have a couple people on our staff who have these networks who, know every single person in these towns. And again, it's just the feedback you get, the small things you can do to tweak your projects. We had a project in Southern California where we rented a cargo container. It was getting tagged all the time. We bought some paint, got a hold of a Girl Scout troop. They painted a mural. End of problem. It never got tagged again. I mean, super easy things like this that if you're just paying attention, pay huge dividends. And I guess the other part that we try and do is, we try and hire our neighbors. We're in farming communities, so if we can hire the guy next door with the tractor, we'll do that. We try and host field days, get people out there, get them engaged. And then, some of the things we're really excited about looking forward, and we haven't done this, but I think there's some really amazing opportunities, and that's the land that we're restoring. We're freeing up a lot of water. And so we have one project, just to kind of paint the picture, we have one project down in the San Joaquin Valley where the aqueduct that supplies all the water to the city of San Francisco runs through our project, right? The 2 tunnels that are taking water, pristine water out of the Tuolumne, it's running through our project, and it's going right past a community that has some of the poorest drinking water in the state of California. So, we're just talking a few thousand feet of pipe. So this water is literally moving all the way across the valley, going past this community. And we're going to free up a bunch of water. So, is there a deal to be made there? I hope so. And I realize those are all, pie in the sky things in terms of regulatory challenges. But I think if we approach these, each one of these opportunities, not just in terms of wildlife, but what can you do to benefit that community? I think there's some really amazing opportunities. Thanks.
So the title is Smart Investment, and I think we would all say any investment in riparian is smart, but the rest of the world doesn't know that. And so I would say, well, one thing I would like to say was I know that all of you work in riparian, but I had the luxury when I was involved in doing the first state wildlife plan of getting to visit every region of the state. And far and away, the conclusion of that report was riparian is the most important habitat in every single part of the state, whether you're talking about the Modoc Plateau or the Mojave or the Coast Range or the Central Valley. And so just saying this to you, again, to reinstore vigor of why we're all here. And that I also would like to, as again, talking about investments, is think about this as the decade of riparian in front of us. Because I think in environmental movement, things come along, and every once in a while, there's this certain inertia, certain base level of groups getting involved all at the same time and say, now is the time to make a big impact. So we have some things coming our way that I think are setting that up. One is we have this Bond Act next spring. And I hope all of you, through your grassroots efforts, get involved in getting it passed. Because that Bond Act will put about a couple $100 million toward riparian through at least a half a dozen state agencies, including the Department of Conservation. We have greenhouse gas dollars flowing in different ways, and probably going to be more ways in which they can be used for riparian habitat. But in terms of smart investment, again, I think when we talk about the multiple co-benefits, what's not really been done is we need an economist to look at those multiple benefits and really start adding up the numbers. One thing I will say, and I think Peter said it with the Wildlife Conservation Board in a session earlier, is that all these agencies have been putting out money, really haven't done very poorly at monitoring the impact or even adding up the value. And in fact, most of our departments have all not done very well when we were audited in the last few years by the Department of Finance to say, how are we monitoring these investments? So that's going to have to change. And in the long run, it's for our good, because in the long run, these costs, these investments are going to be compared versus other activities, either to have a benefit on wildlife or to have a benefit on water or benefit on greenhouse gases. And so one of the things I think this community, the science community, we're looking into collectively, the state agencies, at maybe a new model for how we monitor these kinds of things. And we will be looking for, this group collectively, frankly, would be the group that would come up with what are the criteria might be the same across all riparian habitat, for evaluating the co-benefits, a criteria that we could use that would eventually get adopted, say all state agencies or federal agencies might use to have a consistent criteria to really tap into what are the benefit, what are the numbers for these co-benefits. So that's an area where we need to do a lot of work, and again, we've started a conversation in the Resources Agency to think about a new way to do monitoring of these kinds of investments. The other is, again, while we work in the urban area a little bit and more so come in the future, our organization's mostly about rural areas and agricultural and working landscape. And one of the things that's starting to happen is that counties are finally starting to require mitigation of agricultural lands. There's about 6 counties that require it. We would hope eventually most major agricultural counties would in fact require mitigation for agricultural lands when they're losing ag lands. But the reason I mention that is that, let's just take the Central Valley. Almost all the land is private, and all the riparian corridors that we'd either like to conserve or restore are on private land, on agricultural lands. And so it means that it's going to be, to have, the future investments are going to be interacting more and more with private landowners in order to achieve the results we're looking for. And we need to come up with better tools of how we engage local landowners. So for example, almost all of the easement tools we use are frankly borrowed from habitat easements. They were written for habitat, they weren't written for farmland. And some of them are written quite restrictive. In fact, the reason a lot of landowners don't want to engage in ag conservation. And the reason, again, I think this is so critical is if you engage the agricultural community and you do an easement, that is probably the best opportunity to actually work into an easement a long-term conservation or restoration of riparian. Because it's a long-term document. It actually says, okay, in your easement, one, you're going to conserve this as ag land, but two, a part of the easement is going to be that you're going to widen your buffer on the riparian corridor that crosses your land to a certain amount and maintain it in perpetuity. It's really an ideal tool to do that. We haven't done it that much, but in the future, I think that's where we need to go. But if we're going to do that, we also need to figure out how to write these easement agreements where we have a changing environment, we got climate change, we have ranchers and farmers frankly need to decide, hey, prices just collapsed for this commodity because another country just doubled the numbers. We need to move to a different crop, a different system, and you have to have that kind of flexibility. So I would just say, in terms of investments, we have huge opportunities for smart investments. I think that one of the things, there's riparian projects, but I think, again, another place we need to really be working for riparian is overlaying them into conservation easements and as a standard part of it. But I think, frankly, we need to then, we're going to do some reinventing of how we structure these agreements, because they do have to, if it's going to be the working landscape, they have to have flexibility. So again, my final 2 points is looking at our long-term investment tools and working with private landowners, and the other is we really are going to have to give focused attention on how we measure and account for the co-benefits, because in the end we are going to be competing. You compete with all other expenses, and we have to say, here are the results. We can show what the last 10 years of investment is given the state in return for that investment in riparian. But so I think it's an exciting time. Again, between greenhouse gas dollars and potentially the Bond Act, a lot of money is going to be flowing into this realm. And I think it's important. It's a really good time for all of you to engage with the agencies and help think through, how to prioritize and sub-prioritize how those monies are put out. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. I'm Ellie Cohen with Point Blue. I just want to say one of my goals has been that we make sure that these bond measures actually include money for monitoring, because in the past they haven't. So it'd be like investing in the stock market and never getting a report. No one would ever do that. But we invest literally billions in California without requiring monitoring and without being willing to pay for it. But we're going to have to do that in the future so we can see what works and what doesn't. So at Point Blue, we have 160 staff and seasonal scientists that work to understand the impacts of changes in climate, in land use, and in the ocean, and we work to develop climate-smart, nature-based solutions. I always say our first name is science, but our middle name is partnerships, and it really, everything that we do is by working with others in the conservation community. But it's only been recently that we've started reaching out beyond that. And I think it's really critical for us when we think about satisfying community needs and smart investments, that we think about how we relate our conservation practice to real people, to the people who can make a difference in terms of policy, to the people who are landowners, to the people in society overall. I have 2 examples of work that we do at Point Blue that engages communities, and one is our students and teachers restoring a watershed program. Over the years, we've had probably, I think, 40,000 kids engaged in this program and have restored about 40 miles of riparian habitat and transition habitat between marshes around San Francisco Bay and upland. But one of the newer projects that we have has been working at the Pajaro River, doing a climate-smart restoration project, working with the Nature Conservancy at Elkhorn Slough. And they're engaging about 1,100 students, mostly from agricultural worker communities, 200 community members, 34 teachers. We were able to restore 1 mile through this partnership that reconnected 2 million acres and 3 mountain passes and ranges that ended up having new connectivity for wildlife, helping to bring about cleaner water and all the benefits that we know of from riparian restoration and healthy riparian habitat. So huge success working with the local community and passing off those tools and that knowledge to many people who participated in it so they can take it and run with it. A second example is the work that we do in the rangeland work under Wendell Gilgert, who's here, and Jeff Geipel, and they presented some on this yesterday. We have today 14 partner biologists working hand in hand with local ranchers and farmers, and another 20-some biologists who are working on private lands with farmers, rice growers, and others. And in this effort, we've been able to leverage almost $35 million in conservation on the ground, which is really exciting. But all of this requires building one-on-one relationships with individual ranchers and farmers and landowners one at a time. I can't wait to see the bumper sticker that says, "Changing the world, one rancher at a time." I think that's what we have to do. We have to reach out to these communities in order to make this change. And part of the work in terms of riparian conservation, obviously riparian habitat is part of every habitat type. It's the veins of the life of the planet, literally. And through our work on rangelands, we're looking at all kinds of approaches to healthier riparian, from fencing off riparian habitat to different kinds of cattle management approaches with more rotation, more pasture rest, varying the timing of rest, all of that helping to bring up the water table and helping creeks to flow year-round again. And that's really our goal, is to re-water California so that it benefits everyone. I just want to say that Point Blue was founded as Point Reyes Bird Observatory. When we started, we never talked about people. We had birders that were funders and actively engaged with us. It really was only recently that we've started to include people in our purpose statement about what we do. And I think that it probably is indicative of a lot of the conservation world. We're way late in doing it. It's about time, and it's critical to engage across communities. And through conservation, we can build bridges from urban to rural and many other kinds of bridges across differences and help bring people together to secure our future. Thank you.
So now we're just going to open it up to you folks to ask questions of each other. So anybody have a burning question they want to jump in with?
I have a question. So a couple of us up here have sort of had to broaden our mission, right, to include people and communities. And these are the people and communities that will help us restore natural habitat and that stand to benefit the most from that natural habitat. I'd be really interested to hear the strategies that you've used to, as you say, connect with that single rancher and build one at a time. Because we have the same experience in Los Angeles. And there's 4 million people that live in the LA River's watershed, and it is about those individual relationships. But for a small organization with a staff of 12, it can get a little overwhelming. So I'd love to hear how you guys do it.
We have a great partnership with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and we are literally leveraging funds from the Farm Bill to pay for embedding biologists into local NRCS offices around the state. That kind of model would be fantastic to do in other places. Another way of thinking about it is almost like what we call a data ambassador. So it's somebody who's a scientist who's representing the science, but also has people skills and can work with the community. So when we hire these partner biologists, they literally are embedded in the local community. And when Wendell and Jeff are interviewing them, they're not only asking about their rangeland ecology skills, but we're also looking at the kinds of things they can do in the community. We have one of our partner biologists plays cello in her community orchestra. We're essentially requiring of them to be engaged in the community. So in some places, if you go to the local bar at night, you'll meet some of our staff there with the community members. That's part of it. But by being associated with NRCS, where they have relationships with many of these ranchers and farmers, in part through incentive programs that through the Farm Bill to help them do conservation practices on their land, we can build upon those relationships. And a lot of it, as Wendell will tell you, who's worked with NRCS for 34 years before coming to Point Blue, a lot of it is listening, spending time in the field with the landowners, learning about what their issues are. In the context of climate change, where we don't have a lot of time, It really means that we also need to find people who are leaders in the community. So another thing that we've done, kind of akin to politics, where you would, in a political campaign, you find opinion leaders who can sway other people, and you multiply the effect. We have identified what we call Leopoldian land stewards, named after Aldo Leopold, people who stand for the land ethic in a contemporary way. And these Leopoldian land stewards can help influence other people in the watershed. So thinking about different ways that you can leverage the resources that you have and multiplying that impact. I'm sure you can talk to them afterwards and they'll have much more to add.
And I would echo all of Ellie's comments. I think they're all great points. A couple of other things. We work in really small secular communities, a Dutch dairy community where, you know, it's surprising, but you have to find the leaders in that community. And like I said, we're building projects, so if we can hire those folks or hire their kids or sponsor some event that's important to them in that community, it's just a way of developing familiarity and recognizing, I mean, these folks think that we're enviros that are gonna come in and, you know, change their way of life. And so we just need to make them feel comfortable and listen to their concerns and then demonstrate to them that our projects are going to be reasonable. We want to hear problems if they, you know, if there's something we can do to make it better. And then there's one other thing that we learned the hard way, and that's that you just don't let people take free shots at you. In the beginning, we thought, you know, we don't care what anybody writes about us in the newspaper. We're out there doing good work. We're going to let our project speak for ourselves. And if you're not careful, especially at the beginning, folks that aren't supportive of what you're doing will define who you are in the media. And then it takes a lot more work to redefine yourself. So now, if there is someone who, if there's a group who's actively coming after us, you know, we engage and we will basically try and correct that opinion and make sure that that our position is well defined.
Just one point from the state level. California State University, CSU, has an internship program that they sponsor that'll place interns. The idea is to take people from the community and place them as a college intern in organizations that are doing various kinds of work that ties back to that community, so that both the intern gets experience, but the community gets capacity, and the intern becomes a link between the programs that the internship is serving and the community. And in the places we've started using this in environmental purposes, that intern becomes sort of the linkage between the scientific world and the community world. And not only is there then an exposure to science to the community, but there's this whole cascading educational hierarchy that becomes evident, that this person is talking to high school kids and grammar school kids, and they're seeing that if they stay in high school and there's a potential to become an intern, potential to take a step up. And so it's a very collaborative intern program that's being run, and the internship comes, at this point, it comes free of charge to the local sponsor. The intern program pays for the intern, and the intern, the biggest hurdle is connecting the intern to academic faculty at a participating institution. Right now, there are agreements between all of the junior colleges, state colleges, and UC, but getting the actual individual faculty to participate is the difficult part. But it's a big resource that's kind of underutilized right now. Other questions?
I'll ask a question.
Okay.
I'm curious to know from everyone how your efforts from wherever you are in your agencies and nonprofits, how you're changing your work in the context of climate change and how that relates to the communities you work within.
Well, it comes to that point I just mentioned earlier about writing, for example, we're reevaluating easements because with climate change, we might want to put an easement on land for certain purposes, but maybe in 50 years, that land will no longer serve that purpose because of the way the climate's changed. So it just adds to this thing of, having to have flexibility. Conservation easements, kind of the holy grail is that they be, quote, in perpetuity. Well, there's now a new conversation about some kind of the ability to potentially trade easements in the future, because you might determine a particular area actually no longer serves at all the value you thought it originally would. And so I just think, as everybody else is having to deal with climate change, generally means you start to appreciate concepts of resilience and flexibility, and how do you structure that into a long-term agreement.
So one of the things that I think, especially right now, given recent storms, many recent storms, that's top of mind for our population is flooding, because that is historically what the LA River's primary purpose for existing was. And our region is not adequately prepared in terms of infrastructure, in terms of decentralized infrastructure, to manage stormwater and flood risk mitigation. The river has been one of, if not the only, sort of primary outlet for it. And so we are kind of in the middle of this really interesting and sometimes frightening conversation where the people who live alongside the river and sort of the region as a whole are afraid of the 100 or the 1,000-year storm event that our river is just not built for. There's sections of our river, even in concrete, that are built up to the single-digit storm event. Definitely miles from a 100-year storm event, or definitely miles from the level of event that was in Dallas. So it's really hard to kind of strike that balance when you're talking about removing concrete and reclaiming available floodplain to kind of give the river a little bit more natural meandering effect, and to allow the river to flood in places. That's becoming a bit of a sort of rubbing point for people. Are we as an organization promoting ecological restoration over public safety? Of course not. But do we and have our agencies, our jurisdictional authorities, figured out the answer? What is that nexus where we can have an ecosystem, where we can have access to nature, where our river doesn't have to be a concrete jungle, but while still protecting the public? And I don't have the answer. I'm not sure anybody has the answer yet, but that's something that we're grappling with.
So we have projects from San Diego basically up to Redding in the Central Valley, and I think currently there's probably a couple thousand acres that are in some form of maintenance, i.e. we're in the process of establishing that habitat, or we're going back and reevaluating habitat that we had planted a few years ago. And so this year, I realize this sounds a little harsh, but this year was great for us because Orville Dam almost collapsed, and the spillway, basically failed. And we had two major projects right downstream of Orville Dam, and they survived and did great, and they just loved it. And it was just, it's proof of concept, and it was like, there's resilience here, there is flexibility in this system, and and this stuff works. And we have large-scale, big event demonstrations to take people out and say, here's a choice. There's going to be more of this in our future. San Diego was a little bit more challenging. We had a project down there, 4 years of drought, followed by about 6 weeks of being underwater, 10 feet underwater in 85-degree days right at the middle of the growing season. So, then you have discussions about what plants are going to survive that, and what are the, genetic variability, and just, challenges. But we're learning. We're definitely learning.
I actually want to go back and parlay off something you just said. Yeah, you just mentioned proof of concept being really important, and I agree with that, absolutely. So in the Los Angeles River, out of the 51 miles, there's 11 miles of it that actually is soft bottom, which means there already is some established habitat, and there's opportunity to establish even more. We partnered with the Army Corps of Engineers in the city of LA to do what's called the Arbor Study, which looks at how do we progressively reestablish and improve that habitat in that 11-mile section. And it looks at removing concrete and pulling back the banks. And between the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy and the city of Los Angeles, they've actually been successful in buying a few pieces of property along the river that allow you to reclaim that floodplain. And in this study, we see that it's feasible to do so without compromising stormwater management and flood risk. It doesn't necessarily improve it, but it at least maintains the levels that are there now. And so sort of our priority right now is making sure that that project, in the swirling madness that is the LA River with all the different plans and all the different concepts and ideas and competing interests, we really want to see that project successful, not because that part of the river is the most important or deserves it any more than any other section, but because we think that if we can show that it works there, that people enjoy it, that habitat is reestablished, and that it's not compromising public safety, that it might actually make things easier in the rest of the river.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to the audience for any questions.
Investment into staff people whose job is to liaise with the community of people who govern a lot of private land and private industry and do something as an economic return. And recently they hired their first ever kind of wildlands restoration specialist, and that position was filled for a few years. That person has actually left, but I assume will be rehiring it. But it seems to me that's another place where the state could make a smart investment in expanding the reach of UC Extension to other things that have a lot of private land, big economic engine, lots of good co-benefits for the state. So I'd like you to comment, if you would, on how you interact right now with UC Extension and whether you think there are places where that could be expanded.
I'll one-up you. I think we should reestablish the state watershed coordinator program and put one in every single watershed. And I'm serious about that. I'm having those conversations and looking at new ways to fund that. We funded a study with the Sierra Institute that's working on this right now to look at the impact of watershed coordinators in the watershed projects a decade ago, and their report will come out in the spring, but I got to see some preliminary results, and the general feedback is that watershed program was just a huge success across the state. I'm sure there were exceptions, but generally it was a really good thing to have a non-regulatory person responsible for having a watershed view and bringing people together. I mention that because I see an extension agent as kind of that same kind of a person. They're not a non-regulatory person who has expertise about, say, the watershed and could play that role. So it would be great if, UC Extension was able to expand and put people in that role. I'm not sure that's going to happen soon, because in fact their budget seems to be going the other way. But I do think it just raised the issue. I think this, many of you probably experienced it, but the role of having a non-regulatory person serving as a coordinator with a watershed view is extraordinarily valuable, and hopefully we can somehow get that going again in the future.
Anybody else wants to respond to that one? Another question?
How do you increase natural recruitment of students to become the next watershed practitioners? When I was going to school, I became a scientist, but natural systems, there was like science in a laboratory. I didn't know that I could work restoring the environment. So how do you get out there to get the youth to become us?
We try and warn them early.
So as I mentioned in my intro, a lot of what we do, sort of the tangible programming that we have at our organization is in childhood education. We are training local teachers in next generation science standards. We have a watershed curriculum. It's called Source to Sea, and teaches children how water moves through our region and out into the ocean. And we do our cleanup, which is now the largest urban river cleanup in the country annually. And a lot of Girl Scout troops, Boy Scout troops, and schools come out in sort of droves. And what we have found is that the kids, and we serve, through all of this, I would say we serve somewhere around 70,000 people a year between our digital platforms, our cleanup, and then our in-school curriculum and field trips, things like that. And through all of this, we see that the kids that come into contact with our programming and certainly go through our field trips and actually experience the river firsthand for themselves are changed. You hear comments like, "Oh wow, is this what wilderness is?" And they're standing in a concrete ditch with a couple of trees. But you realize that for a lot of these children in urban areas, they just don't have access to nature. So I think the first step is just exposing them to that, and that often is enough to kind of grow their own interest. But then with our curriculum, if they go through it, if they're one of the schools that has that curriculum in place, we find that they go home, they take that message home to their parents, and their parents start to become civically engaged. We start to see their parents showing up to community meetings about the park or the stormwater project that's being built alongside of the river. I think, though, what I would like to see our programs improve on is not just teaching kids about the river and about the nature in it, but teaching kids how the political system works, right? Now that you have this information, here's the steps that you can take, here's how to move your challenges and your concerns about the river through the system to make real change. And I'm not sure, I know that we haven't kind of hit the nail on the head there yet, and I'm not sure if there's other resources out there that have, but if there are, I would love to hear about it.
Hi, I have a question. Interesting phenomena has occurred on our local creek here. Back in 2000, Puda Creek Council sued the Solano County Irrigation District for not allowing enough flows to maintain fisheries below their dam, below their diversion dam. And the settlement resulted in a flow regime, which was highly, effective for our creek. It really was the major investment needed to revive our creek. Part of the settlement also said you must hire a stream keeper, a person who is hired full-time to look after this creek, research the creek, get grants to restore the creek, and this person was hired in 2000 and has done an incredible job of doing this. His job is to make sure the river is healthy. I mean, we need these everywhere on every creek. Do we need to sue every single irrigation district in order to get this? That seems ridiculous. We just need someone whose job it is to take care of these creek corridors. It's just unbelievable. Now here's a scenario that came out of the blue in the last 5 years. Our streamkeeper got a several $1 million grant, did in my opinion, a river restoration has an incredible restoration job in Winters, California, and the community came out and hated it. Hated it. And they perceived it as the river had been destroyed by these restorationists. And they are up in arms, and they have frozen phase 3 of the project. It can't go forward. They wanted to preserve the degraded state it was in because they were used to it. This is what they thought of as their creek, you know, and then you guys come in and bulldoze it and, you know, plant these little trees, and it's just not the same anymore. You've destroyed our creek. How do we reverse this narrative? John, you said something really powerful. You said something about don't let your opponents define you. And this is what's happened in Winters. And I'm curious, A, how do we get more street keepers without having to sue people? And 2, how do you reverse the story once it's begun on the negative side?
It's a challenge. I think the thing all of us who are involved in this work need to remember is that, you know, we're showing up in the community and we're going, hey, we've got this great plan and we're going to tell you how to manage your land and this is what it should look like. And that's tough for people that have been there a long time. And if you live next door to that and your neighbor's saying, oh, I've seen these guys before, you know, and it's just like, fear is a real thing for people, and it's fear of the unknown. I mean, what we've really seen is at the end of the day, it boils down to fear of the unknown. And so if you can demonstrate to somebody that, you know, we're gonna work with you, and we're gonna make sure your yard doesn't fill up with feral cats, and, you know, rats aren't gonna be scurrying across the landscape the next time the river comes up. You know, my favorite one, I have to throw these anecdotes out there because they're kind of unbelievable, but my favorite one is we did a project down in the San Joaquin, and there was a headline in the newspaper. There was a fire on our project, and we had riparian brush rabbits, and it was flaming brush rabbits are starting fires across the landscape because they thought the rabbits caught on fire and then would run over and catch everybody else's. I'm not kidding, this is in the newspaper. So I mean, yeah, and so it's hard to believe the stuff you're reading. I mean, that's one of the reasons you don't respond, because it's, you know, it seems unbelievable. But I would say work with your local newspaper. People need to go into the Rotary clubs, present to the Rotary clubs. That guy should be introduced to every civic organization in town. You should go to the Farm Bureau and go to their meeting, hang out there. I mean, it's hard work, but you need to just put a face to your work and say, look, we're gonna be here, we're willing to work with you, we need you to work with us.
So I'll add to that there's a concept of co-creating projects, co-creating publications. We should be thinking of co-creating restoration. And that really means, if you're really thinking of it as a joint project with the community, it means engaging them even in the design of it from the very beginning. And I think once you do that, you'll start identifying those opinion leaders, and you'll get media coverage in a positive way. As far as reversing it, I think it means it's harder. It'll take more time. But I think it, again, means identifying a few key leaders in the community that you think you can persuade to understand it, and even perhaps offering to make changes to the plan so that the community feels ownership of it.
Other questions?
I was going to add a comment. When I was at Fish and Wildlife about 15 years ago, I used to give a pep talk to our biologists who used to get creamed in public meetings. And there's nothing more controversial than land, water, and animals. And so, frankly, it's not for the faint of heart, and people are passionate about it. And so there's no getting around it, which the antidote is what John's talked about and what Ellie's talked about, is frankly engaging people early and often, and they're not always going to agree with you. And it's a very slow process, but that's going to make the longer term change, and it just requires that grassroots organizing early on. But the fear of the unknown, if people don't know, they're going to, the other corollary is what people don't know, they assume the worst. Okay, I mean, that's even true in my organization, Department of Conservation. What my staff don't know, they assume us in the executive office are doing the worst possible thing. So that's kind of what undermines my communication strategy. So that's generally, it's human nature. So I just think there's nothing easy about this. It's a very passionate, we all work in a very passionate topic area. And so it's early and often engagement, co-development. I mean, those are the answers, but I think what people don't like to hear, those are very slow and long processes. And, but that's the nature of this kind of work. Because we're making, actually, if you think about it, though, we're making very long-term changes. So it almost makes sense that the preparation and the enactment of it is also a slow process.
So I have a couple questions. First is, when you're looking to make an investment, initially make an investment somewhere, are there specific characteristics or elements of a project site or a riparian setting that you look for that are repeated from investment to investment? Something that sort of is a guidepost for how you evaluate whether the investment is worth it or not.
Just say that I think it depends what your goals are. So we're partnering with some land trust in the Sierra and the foothills, and helping them to prioritize acquisition for what we're calling climate smart easements. Again, it depends what the goals are, but their goals are where can we essentially conserve the most water resources. And so we're looking at multiple watersheds and finding the ones that actually have the most potential to hold the most water through varying ranges of conditions, and then going back to the land trust and helping them to acquire land and riparian corridors in those target areas. And again, it depends what your goals are.
Anybody else?
So the LA River, sort of being what it is and having the constraints it has, and this is not exclusively so, but I would say we look for those soft bottom sections because they're pretty few and far between, and we think that's where we can demonstrate the most success. We also look for areas that have available land adjacent to the channel where we can reclaim some of that floodplain for the same reasons. And of course, we're looking at disadvantaged communities, and so many of the communities that live along the river are in fact disadvantaged because it used to be just this strip of infrastructure, and that's where they were relegated, just like being relegated to underneath or alongside a freeway. So it's not that hard to find a disadvantaged community along the river, but those tend to be kind of the priorities, not just that we're talking about, but that many of the other organizations in the movement are talking about as well.
I would say two things. One is if the project is actually a priority area, as you indicated, and that's usually something written up in the RFPs or whatever, and it says what we're most interested in. But the other is whether the group that's applying has the capacity to effectively implement it. In other words, what is their organizational capacity? So if the organization has a track record of getting it done on time and in budget, that's the kind of group we'd fund. Those people that get funded tend to be the ones that get funded over and over. And there's a reason for that. So if you're a small group and you're just getting started, I think the answer is then to try and team up with a group that already has a track record and do it as a consortium and or of some kind. Because our goal as a funder would be we want to make sure, we want it to get done. And we don't want it to be a year out and the work's half done and the money isn't spent properly or whatever. So I would say those are almost equal things. What's the quality of the project and what's the really capacity to get it done according to the specs?
So this question drives me crazy. This is something people have been, wrestling with for a long time. And there's all kinds, there's been all kinds of databases constructed, and we've looked at, extensive modeling and ecological values, and I think all of that is great, and all of it is really important. But the other part of this is that, how this conversation started. This is really about rivers and communities. And so you can do all the science. You can have all this great science and have, scores for each attribute. And if you don't do the same thing with the community, what happened in winters will come up. And we've had crazy projects where, basically, our philosophy is if we're working in riparian areas, low elevation riparian areas, it's all good. Some of it may be better than others, but it's all good. And so we will take pieces, either buy them or start to restore them, and we're thinking, this is a little sketch. And it turns out that then becomes the cornerstone of like a huge project, and all these other pieces fall into place because we started with that nasty little piece that we kind of, we're kind of scratching our heads, why are we here? And the reality is, at this point, at least for me, I don't know enough about these systems to sit there and say, we can only go here. If it's a choice between two spots, okay, but to turn down a place, I think that's a different question.
Okay, another question. Given that the loss of riparian has really been to other land uses that have commercial value that generate money for people, are there aspects or elements or features of riparian that we can focus on that would provide some or more incentive in commerce for people to pay attention to riparian? Is there some kind of commercial linkage between riparian of the future and the market systems that we're going to be dealing with?
I really want Jim to answer that question. Jim was just telling me, Jim Quinn, who's one of the co-sponsors of this conference, was telling me about a paper that he and some of his colleagues here are working on, valuing other uses of riparian and ecosystem services. Can you address that question, Jim? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Oh, happy to. So that was actually the theme of the first session in room C, and the PowerPoints will be posted, I hope, tomorrow. But this came out of a Forest Service program, which is trying to use the best economic principles to value benefits of riparian areas to downstream communities in ways that measure kind of overall welfare, not just transfer, or not even principally transfer of dollars. And the hope is that this can both better justify investments in riparian restoration, in this case for a federal agency, but in general, and also help focus on what kinds of management strategies actually produce particularly highly valued benefits for the beneficiary community. So we're interested in developing these themes on a much wider basis, and we'll be happy to put together a couple of smart lawyers and GIS people with your sort of place expertises and so on to see whether we can't get more than the sum of the parts out of this.
I'll add to that if we look at some of the recent hurricanes and flooding that has occurred and the amount of money that's already being spent on rebuilding the same way that things have been, I think we have an opportunity here to be able to compare approaches of actually doing things in more climate-smart ways and more eco-friendly ways with nature-based solutions, that it's not going to stop extreme events, but it can make the impacts on human communities significantly lower and the impact on loss of life significantly lower. So I think we're going to have an opportunity, unfortunately, much more in the next few years to demonstrate that. And already public opinion is showing that many more people believe that climate change has a role in some of the recent natural disasters. So public opinion is shifting, and we may have some opportunities coming up in the next few years, which means we have to be prepared to provide the science and the data behind it so the policy can take off.
Other questions? Okay, right here.
And sorry if this is about to turn into an overly specific question, and also I know this is more a surface water crowd, but there has been a lot of talk about the importance of raising the groundwater table, and a lot of talk about the importance of having people look at things at a larger scale. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts about how the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is going to affect water in California in general, or affect your jobs.
I spent an hour at the podium getting grilled by the California Water Commission yesterday. They rejected a proposal that we had submitted. And basically what we were arguing is that the cheapest, most cost-effective way to create additional water or provide additional water to the Central Valley is just to buy up riparian lands, farmlands, and repurpose those water rights. So this might be an overly specific answer, but riparian plants have the ability to utilize shallow groundwater that agricultural crops can't use. So we're pumping deep water or applying surface water, and a lot of it, 4.5, 5 acre feet a year. And if we replace that with riparian species, they can pull the shallow groundwater 12, 15 feet down, which is not available. It's too salty for ag, and it's not being currently drafted for agricultural purposes. So you can basically exchange that shallow groundwater for all the surface water that's now coming out of our rivers. In this case, it was about 10,000 acre feet per year on this one farm that we have. So, and that would be water that you would produce during dry water years as well as wet years. And again, if we think about climate change and water supply reliability, there's also huge advantages. I think several other speakers here today have talked about filter strips, water quality improvements. So you start putting all of those components together. I'll answer all these questions at once. And I think you can get enough economic value. I think we're really, really close to getting, if there's some way to value these, that you could actually start to get some private capital into this exercise that we're all doing. And I think that's when things will get really exciting. But I think it's going to be huge. I think the water implications are going to be huge.
I'll just cite one example that comes to mind when you ask that question, is that there are numerous places in the state where the drop of groundwater is basically meant to dewatering of creeks. And if we take the Poudre Creek example, I'm not sure if anybody's tried this legally, but theoretically under one of the oldest laws in the state is you have to keep enough water in for fish, regardless of what you divert. And maybe you could, now that we're linking groundwater finally to surface water policy, maybe you could make the argument if you overdraft to a certain level where you don't leave enough water for fish. A primary example is, for example, the Mojave River. It's the alfalfa production upstream that's caused the dewatering of the Mojave River, which has caused basically the collapse of the riparian habitat, and the fish and everything go with it. So there might be circumstances in the state where when you're engaged in the new groundwater planning, that you look at where our creeks dewatered specifically due to groundwater, drop in groundwater.
So John, why was your proposal rejected?
Wow.
You don't want to hear that sad story.
We're on camera, man.
It was deemed ineligible. That's what it was. So we can talk later, Peter.
Other questions?
I've got a question for my fellow panelists. Since we all work in sort of vastly different landscapes, I'm wondering, and I know this is a big question, and a complex question, but perhaps your top priority project, what's the price tag that we're talking about? Like, what level of investment?
So I have a vision of scaling up our partner biologist program, our students and teachers restoring a watershed program, all of our working lands programs in a way where we can have simple metrics to measure multiple benefits, carbon, water, biodiversity, and other benefits to people in the community. And to do that, it would require, not that we want people, Point Blue scientists to be on the ground across the country, but where we could train other partner biologists around the country, because most of them actually don't collect data on the practices and whether they're actually making an improvement in the conservation on the land or not. We could help them to do that with simple practices. We have our rangeland monitoring network where we could include people from across the country and what they're doing, so we have a better sense of which management actions are actually helping secure a healthy future and which ones aren't, so we can move the needle and focus more and invest more in the areas that would make a difference for us. To do that, my back-of-the-envelope calculation is that we need $35 million over the next 7 years. Pretty small amount of money to make a difference across the whole country. If anybody is a funder here, you can talk to me afterwards.
We're not that huge of a funder. I think the big thing is usually we require matches, so often we're the match. NRCS and I, we're like brother and sister with the NRCS, so they match us, we match them. Local governments match us, but and if you put a few matches together, then you might have some real money. Actually, specifically the urban area, and I haven't looked at exactly the communities, but there's a new program in the state called Transformative Climate Communities. I'd say it's the first urban conservation effort our department's really been involved in a big way. But basically, it's going to put $70 million into Fresno and 35 into a community in LA and probably 35 in another community. And basically, it's to go into a place-based community, and there might be one adjacent to the LA River. But these applications are coming in now, and it's to go in and do a half a dozen things that are all good for the community, but also for climate. And I would say if it turns out that the LA River's passing through one of these communities, certainly riparian restoration or that kind of thing might fit into the total program. But it's going to involve housing and transportation and other things. But that program is likely to grow, and there's going to be more funding available. And what it is, it's called a place-based effort. It was enacted by the legislative leadership and the governors a few years ago, and this is the first go-round. The other thing I'll just mention of it is that besides the big grants that are going to go out this year, 3 of them, there's going to be planning grants for communities that would like to potentially apply for the big money in the future. And almost all of these applicants will be consortiums of groups that work on multiple issues in a community, and it's for poor communities.
So we're just talking about all of our proposals that have been rejected recently. We applied 6 months ago or something. It was a program called 100 and Change, and it was for $100 million. And basically what we wanted to do with that funding was, I think there are huge opportunities to really address California's water shortage just with how we manage riparian systems. I think there's a really economic, viable approach to our water crisis. And the benefits are flood protection, and then all the wildlife and recreation community stuff is kind of extra. So I think, again, there's tremendous opportunity, and there's just so much work out there, and we need more people doing it.
All right, with that, I think we're going to wrap up this panel. Ellie is going to give us some closing remarks, but before she gets up here, if we could give a hand of appreciation to the panel.